Welcome to Binder TV's Inside IH, where we go inside all things international. This episode, we are here with Joe Torres of Dearborn, Michigan, and we're going to talk about his 1979 Scout II Rallye and his participation with the Great American Build-Off in 2018, which he won. Hi, Joe, how you doing?
How you doing, John?
So tell us about yourself a little bit.
I actually grew up as part of an IH family. My grandparents owned a dealership in the 60s and 70s, and as a kid I heard all kinds of stories about the IH brand and his dealership and the people who worked there. I've always had an interest in International Harvester because of my grandparents and their enthusiasm for the brand, and it actually is what drew me to a career in the automotive industry. Growing up as a boy and into my teens, I often learned and worked with my grandfather on all kinds of projects, including old IH projects that his old customers from his dealership used to actually visit him. Yeah. Even after his dealership closed, they would still come to him to have work done on their vehicles. So I learned how to wrench on cars, and in particular IH products, because that was what was in his shop at the time. And so gradually my enthusiasm for cars grew into almost a desire in life, career-wise, and I ended up becoming an automotive engineer working for Ford Motor Company here in Dearborn. In particular, still working on powertrains, but in my current role I'm actually working on advanced electrified powertrains. So I really do appreciate the combination of an appreciation and understanding of the past combined with the current work that I'm doing, which is really a crusade to work on very advanced new technology.
So you and I have something in common. We both grew up in IH households, and there always were internationals around. When did you notice, or what did you think of them back in the time?
Well, when I was a kid, IH vehicles were kind of like old vehicles that had their day, but weren't necessarily popular where I grew up. They were just looked at as old vehicles. I remember learning how to drive stick on my grandfather's 1110 pickup, which was a learning process in itself. But I have great memories of that vehicle and myself actually driving it, doing odd jobs as a kid and riding with him and learning about mechanics, through him in that vehicle.
So many of us love that IH logo, and it means so much to us. And there's a time when you become aware. When did you think you became aware that IH was important and it got in your heart?
Well, I would say that I've always appreciated the IH brand, and again, it was because of my childhood, but where it really sunk in was when my grandfather died. He died several years ago. I was in my 20s, and it wasn't until after he passed away that those memories started to surface, and I wanted to somehow tie myself to him, and what I decided to do was tie myself to our history, as me as a boy and him as my grandfather, through a vehicle. And
so this is a tribute to him, and what a platform.
Yes.
For preserving history.
Yes, this is a tribute to him as much as it is an enthusiast project for me. If it wasn't for him and those memories, this project wouldn't have occurred. And I thank him for that. But the turning point for me was after he passed away, and recognizing that those types of experience I had with him and the IH brand through him were no longer going to be available.
Well, that's interesting. So what brought you to this project?
Well, this project, I've always loved Scouts. I had a 1976 Scout that I bought when I didn't have a lot of money. I was in my early 20s, and I always had a dream to turn that Scout into something special. And as a result of buying it at a young age, the vehicle sat for a while until I was able or at least in the frame of mind to devote myself to a proper restoration project. That didn't happen as soon as I would have liked. So that vehicle ended up in disrepair and in a state where I wouldn't have been able to restore it to the level of quality that I wanted. So this vehicle came along as a replacement to that one, and it had all the original components that I was looking for. And I've always wanted a true Rallye Scout II, later version, just before IH decided to stop building them, because I had a special look that I wanted. I've always wanted to have a Scout that had a period correct look as a kind of enthusiast vehicle. And this vehicle fit the bill.
So originally it was this blue color.
Yes.
Show them that.
It's a 1979 Scout, and in '79, this is a 1979 dealer copy four-wheel drive IH literature. It was a Highland blue, and it looked identical to this. Everything down to the hub locks, the wagon wheels. It was this vehicle. I decided to go a little bit of a different route because I wanted to have a Scout that I would say had a less popular paint scheme to it.
The color. That brings me to the color and why you picked it. And I will say, Scout Co. Mike Moore had done a couple vehicles with this green and white, and they'd come to the show separate years. And then yours comes, and it's like, here comes another one. And it was nothing against you at all. I really have learned to appreciate and fall in love with this paint scheme. But what brought you to this color?
Well, as I said earlier, I was looking for a unique IH color, and I didn't want to deviate from what the designers at International had produced in the 70s, because again, I wanted that period correct look. And the color scheme on this one is a mint green color on the base with a winter white top and front grille surround, which the mint green was a factory color, and I have to convince people of that when they see the color. They think that that was an aftermarket type color
Yeah, they had
scheme.
the same problem when they were brand new going down the road of what in the world is that, and a few of them sat around and didn't sell.
Right.
Because it was such an odd color.
And I think it was a unique color that perhaps was less desirable back in those days, even in the 70s. But now, the amount of support I've gotten for this color scheme has been overwhelming. People just stop and stare, and they tell me that I picked the perfect combination.
It is unique.
For the look that I was going after. Ultimately, it was a choice that I made with my mom.
Okay, that's cool. Family choice.
Yes, my mother, she in her early life, she was what I consider quite a talented artist, and I got a lot of traits from her in some regards. And when I showed her kind of the scheme that I wanted and the combination of colors I wanted, I figured there was nobody else who could give me advice better than her. And she actually fell in love with the color scheme that I chose, and that was really the final decision I had to make.
Love is in the heart of the beholder, or however it goes. So,
Right.
So how did you go about starting this project? And you didn't start the project just to participate in the Great American Build-Off. You were doing it for your own reasons.
I did it for my own reasons. Again, it was a commemoration of the history I had growing up as a boy with my grandparents, and again, the memories. So,
how did you go about finding the vehicle and picking it?
This was actually an eBay find. When I really had my head organized to start the build process, I looked for years for a good donor Scout, and when I finally found one, I gotta pause for a second. I'm losing my train of thought compared to before.
That's all right. Keep on going.
Yeah.
So you bought it in California and then had it shipped?
I bought it from, I bought the vehicle in California, and I had it shipped back to the Michigan area because there was very few vehicles of this level of quality that I could find locally. And over a 3-year period, the first year was spent doing kind of restoration in my own home of subsystems of parts. before I even dug into things like bodywork and framework, I made sure I restored all the different components of the vehicle, built them up, stored them away, worked on the next subsystem, stored that away, so that by the time the actual full vehicle build came up, it was almost like an assembly line process, which really sped up the overall.
So you built stuff in groups.
In groups,
and then that
yes.
got put aside, and you move on to the next
Yes.
group, found the parts, did the work.
Yes.
And then Brothers Custom come in the picture, and tell us about the experience with them.
Brothers Customs Automotive is a shop in Troy, Michigan that I was actually able to find through a friend. They've been a wonderful partner in this build process. They knew my enthusiasm was real, and they knew that I wanted to participate in some way in the technical aspects of the project. So we kind of broke up our workload, where I worked on the majority of the mechanical and interior pieces of the project, and they focused heavily on the cosmetics of the exterior, the body and paint. It was a wonderful relationship.
A family relationship.
It was a family relationship with Bill and Autumn, the owners of Brothers Customs, and they actually helped my dream come true. I can't thank them enough for the hospitality they gave me in the building of this vehicle. Overall.
And especially since it got into Four Wheeler Magazine, and it's nice that we're here and able to talk about we're going to go into the different components. It's nice to hear from Joe himself instead of reading it is not quite the same. And so what was the feeling, and how did this come about, getting into the Four Wheeler Magazine?
Well, I had no idea that when I first started this project, I had no idea that I would get the support I have from the IH community on this build. I started off on some forums, and the enthusiasm I had, people trying to help me through the build process was just fantastic. So I kind of started off saying, well, let me just do a daily driver. Let me just do a mild resto mod. Unfortunately, the perfectionism in me, the engineering perfectionism in me, was a very difficult thing to overcome. Before I knew it, I started restoring pieces of this vehicle to what I would consider a very, very high level of quality. And then hiring Brothers Customs Automotive was another piece of this puzzle, because they're a type of company that doesn't expect or doesn't accept anything less than utmost quality.
Exactly. So they were kind of what?
We had a relationship of perfectionism that we really didn't disagree on too many things, if anything, and it was because the two of us really insisted on high quality. If I was going to put my name on it, and if Brothers Customs Automotive was going to put their name on it, so gradually what happened is that the build started to come together, and as one part was completed and you compared it to another part that might have been kind of on the fence about whether you want to do a full restoration of that component, as you compare the unrestored parts to the restored parts, you realize that your level of quality keeps building and building and building.
Exactly.
And before you know it, every single component in the vehicle was restored to what I would consider an A1 quality.
So it got noticed.
It was noticed.
Jim Allen got a hold of you.
Yes.
Tell us about that experience.
Well, it was first noticed at the Detroit Autorama. I won a couple awards. It was the inaugural display. Tons of enthusiasm from the crowd.
That's great.
I didn't expect that. I expected they were going to.
What kind of show is that, and what kind of vehicles are at that show?
Detroit Autorama is what I would consider the biggest automotive enthusiast spectacle for classic cars.
Okay.
That,
so we all got the picture of that.
Detroit is a very popular venue for Autorama. It's in a few different cities every year, but the level of quality from builders across the country is viewed.
It's got to be at a certain level.
It's got to be at a certain level, especially in the main level, the main floor, where the majority of the vehicles are located. It has to be impeccable quality, and just to be able to make it as a candidate for the main floor was one thing, and then to actually receive awards from Autorama is another thing. Mm-hmm. And so and then I finally realized, maybe this vehicle really is that good. And And then from there, I went to the National Convention, and I won 5 awards there, including the build-off win.
That's great.
Yeah, and I do appreciate that.
Jim was there, so he had noticed it. And
yes, Jim did notice it.
And so he wanted to do a shoot.
Yes. I actually had approached Jim Allen previously and said, hey, Jim, you know, is there any interest in this vehicle? And gradually we learned over a few months period that there really was some spark there. So I met Jim out in Fort Wayne, where the old assembly plant was, in the proving grounds.
Gotcha.
And we did a photo shoot, and
then it made the cover.
It made the cover.
How in the world that happened?
I had no idea that it would happen. As a matter of fact, I wasn't even sure it was going to make a feature. The fact that it made it onto the online, there was an online article first.
We saw that.
That didn't necessarily mean it would make the cover.
Right.
Because the magazine would come out a few months later.
Sure.
So I was taken off guard. I had no idea. According to Jim, he didn't know if it would have a high probability of success either. But Ken Brubaker at Four Wheeler,
yes,
he is as I understand it, a scout enthusiast,
closet scout enthusiast,
and
yes.
he really appreciated the level of quality and the uniqueness of this vehicle, which actually kind of sold it on the cover. Between the color and the style of resto modification that I did, I think it was the correct vehicle for the cover.
Just blows us away, and then we find out it's been a few years since a Scout and all that has been on the cover, and then maybe even longer since 2.
Right.
You got yours, and then one of the Alaska
Ultimate Adventure
vehicles is on the cover of Peterson's coming up.
Right.
And that's pretty cool too.
Yeah, I was blown away. I would consider the 2 top magazines for four-wheel drive enthusiasts, at least in my point of view, would be Four Wheeler Magazine and Peterson's Four Wheel and Off-Road. And the January editions of both of those magazines included Scouts. One of them was a first-generation Scout that participated in Ultimate Adventure in Alaska just recently, and the other one was mine. So I don't know if this is going to happen again.
It may not, but it's definitely great recognition for our family, IH family, because that's what we are.
Right.
So let's dive into the truck.
Into the car. Okay.
We mentioned the color and Inside International. We want to go into detail on some of the parts and things, who did what suppliers supplied what, and what brought you to BF Goodrich tires. And then these look like Hurricane wheels. Tell us about those.
Well, I'll start with the wheels. I wanted a day 2 period correct look on the vehicle, and what I consider day 2 is a style of modification on a classic vehicle that might have looked like what an enthusiast at the time would have done to their vehicle. I didn't want overly aggressive changes and overly aggressive modifications to what I would consider modern day technology. I wanted it to still look like a customer could have done this level of work themselves shortly after purchase. So naturally, Hurricane 2 style wheels were a huge hit in the 70s, along with wagon wheels and slotted mags. I loved the look of these wheels because CVIs, which is obviously was a
the Green Machine Sport had those, and they color keyed that particular model to the stripe. However, you color keyed yours to the color of the vehicle, and that's unique.
Right. I saw some early photos of that look with the color keyed wheels, and I thought it would look perfect with a green color scheme, this mint green. I thought the color coding the wheel to the paint would be a kind of a perfect throwback.
Oh, it is.
To a 70s look.
It really sets this vehicle off.
Right, and the other thing I wanted to make sure of is with a period correct wheel, the viewers can't really see, but that is a period correct IH logoed Lock-O-Matic hub. I wanted to make sure that the hub locks were exactly the same as original, because an IH enthusiast at the time wouldn't have swapped to a modern hub. So between the wheel and the hub lock combination, it's exactly what a customer would have done back in the day. As far as the tires go, My personal opinion is that BF Goodrich is one of the most reliable and most sought after tire I would consider in the enthusiast market. It's made by a parent company, Michelin. Some may not know that.
That's a great name.
I believe Michelin is among the best, if not the best, tire manufacturer in the world in terms of the quality that they produce for the money. A BF Goodrich is no different. Since it's a Michelin brand, I wanted a tire that was known back in the 70s and a tire brand that was also known today. And BF Goodrich is a brand that doesn't need to advertise.
Right.
And
they're well known.
I purposely opted for a raised white lettering on the outside because that's, again, a 70s feature that would have been around.
And it talks.
It talks.
Really looks good.
Yeah, and this is a 33-inch mud terrain TA tire, KM2, that I think fills the wheel well out quite nicely.
It really helps the stance of the vehicle. It's beautiful. So moving on to the drive line, tie rod ends, drag link, reverse shackles. It doesn't have.
Correct.
Reverse shackles, but what do we do there?
I can start with the springs. The springs are a custom design made by Alcan Spring out of Colorado. They custom make springs for Scouts. They actually have a nostalgia for Scouts, and they're a great company to work for. They made the springs to my spec. This is what's called a spring under axle lift kit. And what that means is that the spring sits, well, literally under the axle tubes, which is the same as what the factory would have done, except these are springs that are recurved, if you will. They're combined with a 5-inch shackle from IH Parts America, and they also include a custom conversion, or I should say a custom modification of the rear spring perch to help improve the caster angle on the front axle. The rear, of course, doesn't need caster, but the front does. So that's pretty much the way the suspension was set up. As far as steering.
Okay, before that, I mentioned the reverse shackle, and I wanted your opinion on that and why you opted not to do it.
Well, the reverse shackle is an excellent choice for an off-road enthusiast, in my opinion, because the reverse shackle kit basically allows the wheel and tire to move rearward. As the tire goes over a bump, it actually will move rearward in the natural motion of the wheel. That helps reduce shock load, and it helps improve drivability. There's trade-offs for and against, I would say, reverse shackle, but for an off-road enthusiast, it is definitely a good option. It requires some modification. I would say relatively in-depth modification, if you will. It's not something you can just bolt on. I didn't do that on this vehicle because that wouldn't have been something that a day 2 enthusiast would have done. I wanted to keep the original look of the spring package, and in particular I wanted to keep the look of the spring steel anti-sway bar that Scouts have in the front. And Jeff Ishmael from IH Parts America actually makes shackles that accommodate the factory sway bar.
Right.
So again, I wanted the truck to look modified, but not overly modified.
Right. I see Bilsteins under there.
Yes, those are Bilstein 7100s using Ford, modern Ford. That's one of the few modern features. It's a modern Ford F-Series shock tower.
Okay.
And I did that because I wanted longer travel, of course, from the shocks. The original shocks used almost like a pedestal style straight shaft with a nut on the top from the factory setup. Now, with modern shocks, you don't necessarily have the flexibility to have that type of a design, so I opted for the Ford shock tower so that I could use an eyelet-style modern Bilstein shock.
They're good shocks, too. Okay, so brakes, what do we do there?
Well, the brakes are factory original front. Not too many people change the front brakes on Scouts, and the reason is because they work. They're disc brakes. They're adequately sized for the type of vehicle. Do they work perfectly compared to a modern vehicle? Perhaps not. But they are known among the enthusiast community as being perfectly adequate as long as they work correctly and they're rebuilt and reassembled correctly. So I kept the factory stock setup in the front. The rear setup I modified to a GM style caliper kit, and that was not necessarily done for performance, because in my opinion, the drum brake, a perfectly functional drum brake, rear disc brake front setup on a Scout that doesn't have extensive modifications is just fine. I wanted the rear caliper conversion purely for aesthetics.
So you see through those
I wanted
beautiful
to be able to
Hurricanes.
see through the wheels and see the rotors through the rear wheels.
Okay, so what do we do to the steering box? Any
Yep.
modifications to the steering system?
So it's an original factory Saginaw steering column. From the steering column, I opted to replace the rag joint with a Borgeson setup. The Borgeson setup transfers a little bit more vibration than the factory rag joint. That's why the rag joint's there. It helps reduce vibrations to the steering wheel, but the Borgeson setup is, I consider, a little tougher, a little bit more robust from a loading point of view.
It's a great upgrade.
Right. And then from there, I went to Precision Steering Components out of Texas to have my Saginaw steering box rebuilt to my specifications.
So you must have done some research on that.
I did a little research, and PSC is, I consider them a fantastic company that supports the aftermarket enthusiast community with custom modified parts. They did a great job on the steering box. From the steering box, I ended up with a Parts Mike high steer kit, and I did that because with the lift kit, I wanted to try to keep the geometry on the tie rods and particularly the drag link pretty benign. I didn't want aggressive angles, so I used a slightly modified custom bent pitman arm with a high steer kit to keep the geometry reasonably mild.
Gotcha. So what do we do on the exhaust system?
The exhaust is what I would consider pretty custom. It started off with a Stan's Tri-Y setup at the engine. Again, I would argue that for an IH engine, modifying the exhaust isn't necessarily going to give you huge gains. These engines weren't necessarily breathers. I did it again for aesthetics. I used ceramic coated Tri-Y headers, two flexible collectors. I consider Stan's excellent quality products for IH enthusiathoods.
Yeah, they're a good supplier.
Yes. And as I said, I opted for a ceramic coating in black that I think really rounds out the underhood appearance combined with the black inner fender panels. So I opted for that setup, and then I went to a 2.5-inch stainless exhaust, custom, all the way to the rear. Originally, this truck would have had a catalytic converter in a single exhaust. I opted for a perfectly identical exhaust system, dual, from the front to rear.
Flowmasters?
I ended up with Flowmaster 50 series mufflers, and those end up going to Flowmaster 2.5-inch matte black coated exhaust tips. And I think the 50 series is a perfect combination of good road noise quality at cruise, but when you really want to step on the pedal, you can actually hear the engine roar.
This vehicle sounds fantastic. It has a very good tone. Electrical upgrades, anything?
Yeah, the electrical system, there's a lot of people out there who believe that completely tearing out the factory wiring and replacing it with an aftermarket wiring kit is the way to go. There's nothing wrong with that. It requires some skill, but I did not do that. And the reason why is because I didn't need to. This was a California vehicle, and in the later 70s, starting in roughly mid-78, IH made an upgrade to Scout electrical systems that included some real significant improvements to fix some of the flaws that plagued the vehicles in the early days. So I kept an original factory style alternator amperage output, and what that did is it allowed me to keep the original ammeter, use all the original gauges, and not have to worry about any type of overcurrent conditions or any type of thermal conditions that would be problematic. The only thing I really did to the harness was clean up the terminals, use new convolute, replace plastic connectors where they were starting to get brittle with age. But other than that...
So we still got glass fuses. You didn't
still
see
have
any
glass fuses.
reason to go into the new push button,
No.
fuses.
No, I don't really see anything wrong with glass fuses aside from the ease of removal. The new fuses they function. The new fuses are a lot easier for removal. They're probably better in some areas, but for the use that I'm putting this vehicle through, I don't see anything wrong with the original glass fuse setup.
Not at all. What about radio? What'd you do there?
The radio. So this was a rare, interesting radio combination. It's the factory stereo sound system, which IH called stereo. It's actually a 3-speaker sound system where the right bank is actually the speaker in the dash and the speaker behind the passenger seat.
Oh, let's not put that 4th speaker in there.
Right. The left speaker was, the left part of the stereo was just the rear speaker behind the driver. So it was an 8-track setup. Again, a factory 3-speaker stereo system. A lot of people think those rear Motorola speakers behind the seats were actually aftermarket. They were not. They were cut by IH factory as an option. I cleaned up the radio, cleaned all the terminals, spent several hours going through all the little mechanisms, replacing components for the 8-track. I carefully inserted a new aux input into the radio so that I could run a Bluetooth input into the speakers, into the radio, and play songs and whatnot through my iPhone. So that's the only modification I made to the electrical system, truthfully, is just allowing some Bluetooth output, but otherwise it's stealthily stock from my point of view.
That's fantastic. Well, do me a favor. We're going to take a break, but while we're on break, go to ihscoutfitters.com. Merchandise there is cool. It's IH stuff. It also supports what we're doing here. We'll be right back.